Hello everybody, this is lesson 5, sorry. In this lesson we're going to deal with schools of thought. This lesson is quite theoretical. It's like the history of linguistics. I think that sometimes it's important to have an idea of how linguistics has evolved around the years and to see more or less the history of it. So, first of all, let's start with Aristotle and Plato, right? That before the 19th century, and language in the Western world was of interest mainly to philosophers, okay? And they made major contributions to the study of language, but those contributions were mainly oral. Like they asked questions as regards what language is, where language comes from, the idea of language, and for example, Aristotle divided it into subject and predicates. They started analyzing language and thinking about language. Plato distinguished between verbs and nouns. That was like the first attempt, of studying language. Then in 1786, the late 18th century was regarded as the birth date of linguistics. Why? Because there was an Englishman called Sir William Jones, and he was mainly concerned with the origins of language. What is the common source of all languages? So he pointed out, it was like a huge academic meeting, and he pointed out that Sanskrit, which is the old Indian language, Greek, Latin, Celtic, and Germanic, all had striking structural similarities, and he concluded that these languages must spring from one common source. So they were, as we were studying in the last units, he was concerned with the origins of language, to find a common root for that. So for hundreds of years, many scholars tried to find a common ancestor, for all languages. And so one of it was the Proto-Indo-European, from which all these languages were descended. So you see that here you have Indo-Iranian, Armenian, Italic, Germanic, German, English, etc. So that was their first attempt. So in the early 19th century, there were four best-known scholars in the linguistic science of the early 19th century, which were Rask, Grimm, Bock, and van Humboldt. They were able to show that almost all of the languages of Europe and many languages of Asia were all related. So you see that it was like a common sense or a common idea of finding, the search for the first source, of human languages. So this is from Trask and Mablin. You have Bob, Grimm here, and Rask. This family of languages, called the Indo-European family, is ultimately descended from a remote ancestor, which we call Proto-Indo-European. Very good. And I found it very interesting that you have an example of the kind of systematic correspondence that have the common things among languages. So you have fish, pieces, know the initial consonants like father, pater, food, 4, 6, exa, 7, septem. You see that they analyzed, common characteristics of languages. And then we have Wilhelm van Humboldt, which is the brother of Alexander van Humboldt. Remember the explorer in 1767, 1835. He was a German polymath who tried to develop a universalist and philosophical approach to the study of language. So the central fact of language is that speakers can make infinite use of the finite resources provided by their language. Can you match that with the features of language? Okay, that is productivity. And that was also coined by Chomsky. You see that there is a relationship between Chomsky, how he took ideas from, different sources and different scientists and linguists. And though the capacity for language is universal, the individuality of each language is a property of the people who speak it. So everybody can speak a language, but each language differs because that is a property of the community, yes, of people who speak that. And he conceived a theory of inner and outer forming language, which is the reflection of the speaker's mind. So he says the language and the thought of people are inseparable, but he distinguished that inner and outer form of language. So it is a kind of a structural conception of language. Outer is the raw sounds of the language. Performance has to do with production. And inner is the pattern of grammar, meaning imposed upon the raw material and differentiated language. That is the knowledge of grammar. That is competence. Another idea of Humboldt is that language as dynamic. He says that language is an activity. It's not the product of activity, not a set of actual utterances produced by speakers, but the underlying principles of rules. Again, Chomsky, universal grammar. Okay, these ideas influence or emerge again in Ferdinand de Saussure's structuralism and Noam Chomsky transformation and generative grammar. You see that Saussure and Noam Chomsky took ideas from Humboldt. Okay, now we move to the mid of the 19th century with Darwin. He published his famous Origins of Species, putting forward the theory of evolution. So it seemed natural, yes, to attempt to chart the evolution of language alongside the evolution of species. And we also talked about this in the Origins of Language, that when human species evolved, we changed, yes, the form of the larynx, the mouth, the lips. So he said that language evolved along with the evolution of species. And okay, so now we move to modern linguistics. That was the mid-20th century. Now we are in the late 19th centuries and the early 20th century. And there is a shift of focus from historical concerns of changes in languages over time to the idea that language can be viewed as a self-contained and structured system situated at a particular point in time. And this forms the basis for structuralist linguistics. So, up to this point, they were concerned on how languages change, okay, and the sources of language or where languages come from. But now, what it is important is to see a language as a system, a structured system that it is set at a particular time. And they studied how language is particularly in that time. That is a structuralist linguistics. So, the emphasis in the 20th century, the emphasis shifted from language change to describe the language. So linguists began to concentrate on describing single languages at one particular point in time in a static or synchronic study of a given state of the language. And we're going to deal with that idea of synchronic or static at a particular time in time. And here comes Ferdinand de Saussure. He was a Swiss scholar, and he's labeled as the father of modern linguistics. And I'm going to ask about him, yes, at some point. So his students collected together his lecture notes after his death, so he didn't publish anything, just his students published the course in general linguistics in 1815. So his crucial contribution was his explicit and reiterated statement that all language items are essentially interlinked. We cannot study sounds, and we cannot study words, and we cannot study syntactics isolated. Yes, everything is interrelated. Okay, and he compared it with a game of chess, a system, yes, in which each item is defined by its relationship to all the other elements. Yes, we cannot have items in isolations. So there were three important heads for his ideas. Okay, and he formalized and made explicit the dimensions of linguistic studies. One is synchronic, which is descriptive linguistics, something that I have just mentioned to you before. And diachronic, it is the historical linguistics. So, synchronic languages are studied at theoretic point in time, and diachronic languages are studied from point of view of their historical development. In synchronic study, a state of language disregarding whatever changes might be taking place, the state of what is going on with the language at this point, exact point. And diachronic study examines overall linguistic phenomena or describing the language change over time. That's historical linguistics. For example, exploring contemporary use, and the other is changes which have taken between old and modern English. Okay, so here we have diachronic. Okay, it's horizontal, and diachronic is like a cat, yes, in time. Okay, and more examples. This is from Truscott Mablin. We might examine the English speaker synchronically for its own sake. So I study at this point just English of Shakespeare, but I can study as a stage in the development of medieval English into modern English. So how Chaucer, Shakespeare, Swift, Dickens. Number 2, he distinguished langue and parole. Langue as the actual phenomena or data of linguistic utterances, and parole is the linguistic competence of the speaker. So langue is what the speaker knows, parole is what the speaker produces. In French, langue means language, and in parole means speech. So langue is a language system shared by a community of speakers, and it describes the social, impersonal phenomenon of language as a system of science. And parole is the concrete act of speaking in actual situations by an individual speaker. It describes individually, not the social, not the whole impersonal phenomenon, but parole describes the individual, the personal phenomenon of language as a series of speech acts made by a linguistic subject. So one is social, collective, okay, and the other has to do with the person, what the person speaks and the speech acts of the individual. There was some similar pairs of concepts have been developed, yes, later on. So we have langue, we can also call system, code, language, competence, form. Parole can be use, can be message, verbal behavior, performance, function. Okay, and the number 3, the head number 3, has to do with the science. Yes, the history of science. Something that we have dealt with in semiotics when we studied animal communication. So that's why you see that everything is interlinked here. His linguistic sign is a union of the signifier, which is the form, the sound, the object, and the signified, which is the meaning and the function. Yes, and the relationship of sound and meaning in language is arbitrary. There is no connection. Yes, I can say tree in English and árbol in Spanish. They don't have anything to do with it, with the tree. Yes, with a real tree. So this is from Becker. You see the meaning and the expression, the concept, which is signified, and the expression tree is the sound pattern, the signifier. So the signified, the concept, and the signifier, the expressions. And it is arbitrary. Okay, so up to now we're going to move to structuralism in America.